So today the ATF released their final rule on frames and receivers, which essentially targets so-called ghost guns or 80%ers. So let's talk about what this new rule actually does and all the things that you should actually know about what's in this rule. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think the ATF needs to be abolished, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, which is Sonoran Desert Institute. Sonoran Desert Institute is an online accredited college that you can actually go to learn about the firearms industry. You can learn ballistics, how to actually manufacture various firearms, and it's really good for those individuals who actually want to kind of step into the firearms industry. We all don't actually have to be attorneys and go to law school to actually be part of the firearms industry. So if you're interested, if you want to learn more about SDI, you can visit the link down in the details section. And thank you again, SDI, for sponsoring this video. So like I said in the intro, the ATF just released their final rule on frames and receivers, or their attack on so-called ghost guns, this morning. We knew that this was coming for a while, and indications were that the ATF was going to hasten the release of this new rule, and that ended up actually being true with the release of it this morning. Last night, word was circulating around that Biden and his administration would be releasing the frames and receivers rule today, and we also would be getting a nomination of a new director of the ATF, which is Steve Dettelbach. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. It's Dettelbach. Now, I'm not going to go in depth on this individual's background, this new director of the ATF, or this nomination for the ATF. That's going to be a different video. But just understand he's very anti-gun. He's called for bans on so-called assault weapons. He's very much for red flag laws. So we'll talk about more of that later. But in this video, I want to focus more on this new rule because there are a ton of questions that people are asking me now in relation to this new rule. Now, I'm still currently going through this final rule to see what all the significant alterations maybe were from the proposed rule to this final rule. Just understand that this rule that they released is about 364 pages. I'll link it down in the details section if you want to go about it yourself, if you want to take a look at it. But again, I'm still going through it. I wanted to pull some of the important things that I've actually noticed to answer a lot of the questions that I've been getting, but I'm still making my way through all this, and likely I will probably have to do a follow-up video at some point to further elaborate on maybe some other things that this new rule is doing. So first and foremost, a lot of people have been asking me, when does this new rule actually go into effect? This new rule does not go into effect today. Just because they release this new rule doesn't mean it's effective today. The new rule says that it has effect 120 days after the releasing or the registration of it hitting the Federal Register. So 120 days from today would be around August 9th of this year. So that's when this new rule will go into effect. Now, many of you also are asking me, what are the impacts of this new rule? So first and foremost, it changes various definitions to where 80%er kits are treated as firearms. Also, privately made firearms, i.e. firearms you made from your own home at your own house from 80%er kits or maybe 3D printed, will also be deemed firearms if you ever tried to sell them to a gun store. Now, it does this by changing various definitions, which you can actually find starting on, I believe it's about page 291 of the rule. If you want to look at that for yourself, that's where all the new definition changes are. The one thing I'm gathering from this document is that it appears that this will only apply to specific kits. So buy, build, shoot kits, it's specifically targeting kits. It's not targeting just those general 80%ers, it's specifically kits, and it's targeting those for serialization and background checks. Now, with the definition changes, what is going to happen from here? Well, under this new rule, there will be an impact on gun stores and FFL holders. There will be an impact on specific manufacturers of these items. And finally, it will also have an impact on us average citizens who want to purchase these items. So let's go through each of those. First, an FFL/gun store will now have to serialize 80%ers that they have in their inventory. Also going forward, anyone who sells an 80%er to an FFL, that FFL will then have to take that item and serialize it before they actually try to resell it to someone else. So gun stores will have the burden of having to serialize their current inventory and also any future items that come to them before they try to sell them. On top of this, they will have the dual responsibility of running background checks on individuals who decide that they want to purchase these items after the rule goes into effect. So going forward, after the effective date in August about is what we said, you will only be able to purchase an 80%er from a gun store if the items have a serial number on them and if you have a background check run on you. As far as a further individual impact, there was concern with the proposed rule that the individuals would have to be mandated to take their currently possessed 80%ers or home-built devices to a store and have it serialized. From what I've seen in the rule so far, I don't see that you have to do that. I could be wrong. This could be something I'm just missing. Again, it's a 364-page document. But as far as the actual serialization of currently possessed 80%ers or 3D printed firearms or items that you've built out, you don't have to go to an FFL to serialize that. The only time you'll have to do that is if you decide you want to sell it to a gun store. At that point, the gun store will take possession of that, pay you for whatever, and then they have to serialize it before they resell it. Now, one of the larger impacts of this new rule and what it will have will actually be on manufacturers who sell these items. The manufacturers will be required to serialize all of their kits that they currently have, and they will also be required to serialize any future items that they manufacture and try to sell. The final rule states that the time limits to mark various firearms is different depending on what type of firearm they are classifying it as. A non-NFA weapon, well, then you will have about 7 days after the completion of the manufacture process to serialize that. So manufacturers, if it's a non-NFA item, essentially what they're talking about is like non-suppressors or non-other NFA items. They'll have 7 days after the completion of the manufacturing process. And for NFA firearms or items, they will need to be marked at the close of business on the next day. So that's kind of the impact on those three main groups: the individuals, the manufacturers, and the gun store / FFLs. Now, I know I'm also going to get some questions about individuals who have concerns about 3D printed items. There's a whole 3D printed world, various channels that specifically focus on 3D printed firearms. I'm looking at you, Print Shoot Repeat. I got to actually meet him out at the Gun. He's a really cool guy. But there was a lot of concerns about the 3D printer world. This rule essentially will not mandate serialization of 3D printed items, and they will not mandate that you have to serialize them to maintain possession of your personal collection. The rule states nothing in the proposed rule restricted persons who are not otherwise prohibited from possessing firearms from making their own firearms without markings solely for the personal use. Nor did the proposed rule require individuals to mark PMFs or personally manufactured firearms when they occasionally acquire them for a personal collection or sell or transfer them from a personal collection to unlicensed in-state residents in accordance with federal, state, and local law. So what does that really amount to? Well, essentially not a whole lot's going to change. Mainly what's going to change is kind of the similar thing with other items that are built where individuals won't have to serialize them until they actually sell them to a gun store. And even then, you don't personally have to serialize them. It's going to be the gun store. So essentially, if an FFL or gun store decides that they want to purchase one of these 3D printed items that doesn't have a serial number on it, then they will need to actually serialize it before they resell it. There were also concerns about what about like CAD files and things like that. Essentially, this rule states that regarding computer files, the rule as proposed and finalized does not regulate the domestic distribution of CAM or CAD computer files. So I know some 3D printers, like I said, were concerned about that. So as of right now, the status quo about like files, online files, and sharing files will remain the same. This rule's not going to change any of that. So I just wanted to answer that question because I could see that popping up. And one last major question that I've seen already popping up that I want to hit on is some people are asking, well, will this impact AR-15 uppers or similar uppers, and will those uppers have to be serialized? And the answer to that is no. The final rule has this grandfather mechanism in it. I hate grandfather mechanisms. Essentially, it's a way for them to try to soften the blow and get people to join in on and think it's not that bad. But essentially what it's going to do is it says that if the ATF has already determined that a specific part of a firearm is the part that actually needs to be serialized, that they identified that this is the frame or receiver, whatever, that's what is going to go forward. They're not going to change that. They're not going to require multiple serializations on uppers and lowers and that they be the same. Essentially, everything's going to stay the same. They're going to have that grandfather. So they said on an AR-15, the low receiver, that's what needs to be serialized. That's what's going to happen going forward. They're not going to change that. Along these lines, I've also seen some other questions pop up about what about fire control groups, like with the SIG P320 drop-in trigger groups. This rule also addresses that. There was a response to a public comment where they were discussing these specifically dropped-in fire control units. And again, this kind of is going to fall into that grandfather mechanism that they said is in this new rule, where they've already identified that that fire control unit is what needs to be serialized. So when that is sold, that's what needs to be serialized. They're not going to then mandate, I guess, that the handgun frame also be serialized and then the slide also be serialized. So again, kind of that weird grandfather mechanism that they're throwing into this. Now, the last thing I want to hit on in this video is the retention of records and that change that's in this new rule. The rule states that the rule finalizes with minor changes the proposed requirement that all licensees retain their records until the business or license activity is discontinued, either on paper or in an electronic format approved by the ATF. The rule then goes on to say that they will have to retain these records indefinitely until they close their business. So the changes from that 20-year period where after the 20 years, the gun store could then kind of get rid of those records, destroy their records, not maintain them. This new rule is saying, well, you have to hold on to all the records indefinitely until your store is shut down, until your business is no longer operating. And then at that point, they have to give all those records to the ATF. So that's just a quick rundown of what sticks out to me in the final rule so far. I think that will answer a lot of your primary questions that are likely going to pop up because you're hearing about this new rule and maybe you have some concerns or questions. I think that will answer a lot of those questions. But if you have any questions that popped up, go ahead and comment them down below. Also, if you like this video and like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Al Gore's rhythm. It adds fuel to his jet and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. Again, I want to thank everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, who shares these videos. You guys are directly impacting these videos, impacting this channel, and helping me to reach and educate more people than I could have ever thought. So thank you so much for all of your support. And as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget to stay with Built by Arms Scholars and stay with Maintain by Arms Scholars.